All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Psych 381. So hopefully you're all in the right place. That's why I like getting in here early and putting up the signs. Sometimes you end up with people in the wrong classrooms. But yeah, so hi, I'm Dr. Campbell, or Kimberly, whichever you prefer. And today we're going to just do a little bit of the whole day one stuff. The standard, here's what's in our syllabus, here's what to expect for the course. And then depending on how our timing goes, we're going to at least start chapter one. I highly doubt that we'll end up finishing chapter one. We'll just sort of go until we feel like we've done enough for today. But if you've been in a class with me before, the next couple of slides will be fairly familiar. But I always like to start by introducing myself and just sort of the way I approach teaching. And then we'll get into the talks about what we're doing for this course and how we're going to approach that. And then we'll get into real stuff. But my standard introduction starts with, here is sort of my academic background on paper. And I always explain that when I was an undergraduate, I didn't quite understand why all of our instructors end up doing this. Because it seems really weird to just stand there and be like, hey, everybody, nice to meet you, here's my resume. But when we're doing scientific studies, when we're teaching about science, it actually makes sense to vet the credibility of the source of information. So why do I deserve to stand here and teach you about this topic? Well, here's part of it. It's not the whole picture, and we'll see that my background's a little bit atypical to be teaching what I teach. Because if we actually start with my Bachelor of Science at Dalhousie, that was actually a Bachelor of Science in biology. My expertise was in genetics and evolution. I was doing DNA sequencing on single-celled organisms that lived in the soil, which is a very strange transition to then end up in psychology. But somehow they were convinced that my bio background was sufficient to come here and start working with birds. You know, single-celled organisms, 2 songbirds. I didn't see the connection, but they let me get away with it. So I came here, I got my master's and my PhD with Dr. Sturdy in the Songbird Neuroethology Lab, which is our fancy way of saying that we just studied how songbirds, specifically chickadees for the most part, how they learn and produce different vocalizations. So that's where that learning component comes in. Our lab has actually ended up teaching this course most semesters for as long as I've been here, which at this point is actually about 10 years, which is sort of scary to think about. But so that's my background. And if we wanted to go a little bit weirder than that, the whole bio to psychology, I actually started my Bachelor of Science in physics and then realized that numbers are not my forte. So I always give that disclaimer because you'll notice when I include dates, I will tell you repeatedly, I don't test you on dates, mostly because 9 times out of 10, I'm going to either say them wrong or they're going to be wrong on the slides. I have over time corrected them when students have pointed it out, but I don't trust you to remember them if I can't figure it out. I'm slightly better with names, but for the same reason, if I give you a name and a question, it's usually someone that we've talked about over and over and over again. And for my own sanity, I usually give you extra bits of information so you know who I'm talking about, even if you're not a name person. And that goes for students as well. I feel really, really bad, but I teach about 1,200 students a year, and I don't remember names even when it's smaller classes. So if ever I don't remember your name, don't feel bad. I will remember your face and what we talked about, and I think that's the important part. But if you email me and you have a specific question, if you remind me what we've talked about in person, I'll remember much, much faster. I also include a little bit of sort of me outside of academia because, especially when we switched to online with COVID, it's really hard to be personable with people. And it felt very detached, mostly because I was teaching to large rooms of sort of black boxes with no videos. So I wanted to give a little bit of my own personality. So I am a bird lover, which you'll figure out I did research with birds, and then when I got out of the lab, I got my own birds, and I am slowly collecting more and more, though I am cut off until I have a larger space to live in. But I have 3 conures at home, and I actually have pictures of them here and coming up as well. It was more important to warn people about that when we were doing online, because they are free-flying and they would make appearances in recordings. And if you've ever seen conures, they're fairly loud creatures, so I didn't want to startle anybody. But I do use them as examples and I talk about them all the time, so that's part of me. I love chocolate. I usually keep some stashed somewhere. When I had an office in my office, I don't technically have an office anymore on campus, which is why our office hours, as we'll see, are actually just an extension of class time. I like to wrap up a little bit early and give us a chance to chat. And I found I answered more questions just hanging out in the classroom than I ever did when I had real office hours. So I've kept that tradition, which may or may not have been influenced by not having an office. I like photography. I sort of switched from doing fine art to photography when grad school kind of ate up all my free time, and I've kept it around. I've been playing the Pokemon games since I was a very small child, so I started with, I think, Gold and Silver, and have caught all the ones up until the most recent release, so I still play those. And I like to collect hobbies. I try stuff whenever I see it. So I knit and crochet and paint and sculpt and whatever tickles my fancy at the time. So sometimes those will influence the examples I use in class. But that's sort of me as a person, and my personality will kind of bleed over into how I teach and what we talk about in the classroom. But back to the more sort of academic side of things, I mentioned sort of showing why I deserve to be here and why you should listen to me as an instructor. Like I said, my undergraduate research, not such a great connection. I did sequencing of DNA to identify single-celled organisms in soil samples, which is the sort of fancy way of saying that we'd drive down to the beach at low tide, dig down in the muck until we got to an anaerobic layer where there's no oxygen, and we'd take home buckets full of mud to go and sequence the DNA and see what we had. We were looking for specific organisms. We were actually studying how we developed and or lost mitochondria in different lineages, which is a really cool topic, but I dropped that as soon as I could because lab work was not really for me. For graduate research, I switched over. Like I said, I started working with black-capped chickadees. The lab also works with zebra finches, though I didn't do too much with those. But we'll see that zebra finches are a pretty common model species because they allow us to study the learning of vocalizations. But we did learning and communication and the learning of those aspects of communication in black-capped chickadees. So I've done everything from bioacoustic analyses, meaning that we would record their sounds and see if the sounds changed over time under different conditions. I also did things where we would play information back at the chickadees and study their behavior. We'd look at how they form categories and learn different concepts. Very, very cool research. And a lot of those types of studies will end up being examples for topics in this course because it's a nice way to make those connections. So when we start talking about operant conditioning, that's a lot of what we did, so I'll use stuff from that lab in order to illustrate those points. And as promised, the additional pictures of my conures. So I have 3 of them. We have Link is the first green cheek, Chic is the yellow one, and then Starbuck is the far one over there. So these are going to appear in examples and anecdotes as time goes on. Students always ask me, have I been able to train them really well because I teach about learning? And specifically when I did the behavior modification class, they were like, oh, you must be really, really good at that. And I was like, I more use them as examples of how they have trained me because my behavior has changed dramatically. Theirs, not so much. All right, and then my last bit about myself is talking about my approach to teaching. And this is another one of those things that I've really liked including just so you guys know what to expect from me as an instructor and kind of why I structure stuff the way that I do. So my ideas are that material should be accessible. So you might have noticed I have a little headset on. I record my screen whenever I teach. So I have a screen grab of this, what's up on the slides, and I record my voice along with that. So after every class, I dump that on YouTube, and then I post the link to EClass. There's a bunch of different reasons why that's useful. One is if somebody's sick, I don't want them feeling like they need to come to class. You're not all going to want to make friends with people in the class to borrow notes from, and that's not the best way to learn anyways. So I can record stuff. I got really good at it over COVID. I kept it around. Also, when you put stuff on YouTube, it auto-generates subtitles. So you can actually download the transcripts from all the lectures and actually have almost word for word everything that I say in class, which again, some students find really, really useful. And the last bit is sometimes, even if you come to class and listen, we cover a lot of information, and some of it's kind of dense. So maybe you want to go back and watch it again. You want to watch a certain section. You want to watch the whole thing. Maybe before the exam, you want to watch it on 2 times speed. That's all available to you just by recording it and uploading it. So all very good examples for that. So that's one thing that I do. I'm also going to be doing a bunch of other stuff to make stuff accessible, but we'll get into that as we get to our sort of syllabus and the layout of the course. I also encourage you guys to make use of the resources that are available. So my weekly office hours, like I said, is just me hanging out at the front of the room. I am also available if you wanted to set up, say, a Zoom meeting, or if you want to meet at a different time, if I can tie it into either before or after class so I'm on campus, I'm open to doing that as well. You just have to email me and tell me when you are available. I post videos of not just the lecture, but also other topics that might be relevant. So, hey, maybe you need a refresher on Pavlovian conditioning or operant conditioning or something. Check the links on our EClass, and there's usually going to be something that's indented a couple of extra times, and it'll just say a reference video with the topics so you know what you're looking at. Myself and my TA, Sarah, who is not here today, but she might pop in every once in a while, but she's also going to be a good resource. So if you have questions about content and it's still not clicking, you can send an email to one or either of us. Usually with emails, I like to encourage you to give me as much information as possible, because I've had things like, hey, I don't understand classical conditioning. Well, that is a very broad topic, and I could write you paragraphs on that, but what part don't you get? And what part do you get? So tell me what you do understand, and tell me where it starts to fall apart, and I'll give you a much more concise response. But yeah, so that's the broad approach there. My other sort of little addition here, this is another one of those things that I wish I knew when I was an undergraduate. I like to include this extra blurb about how the heck do you talk to people in academia. So I was one of those students where I didn't talk to anybody, I didn't talk to my instructors or anything until I was in my 5th year, because it took me 5 years when I switched over. And once I figured that out, it was like, oh, there's all these unspoken rules that nobody really tells you about. And some people get really offended if you don't use the correct title, but they also don't tell you what the correct title is. So this is the cheat sheet on what is the correct title and how the heck do you figure it out. So you've probably heard the term doctor and the term professor and maybe instructor. And those are the ones that are most important, at least with your instructors, the people teaching your classes. So doctor is somebody who has a PhD. So when I introduced myself, I said Dr. Campbell, because I have a PhD in psychology. So that works. That is my official title. Professor is going to be somebody, usually a doctor, who's hired and their job title is professor. So they are a professor of whatever area. So a professor of psychology or a professor of biology, wherever they've been hired. Instructor is also a job title, and that's technically my job title. I'm not a professor. I have been hired as a sessional instructor. So that is my official role at the university. So you can call me doctor, but you couldn't call me professor because it's not the correct title. Mostly people are going to prefer that you're going to use what applies to them. If in doubt, doctor is usually safe, but you can also sort of double check on the university website as to what credentials people have if they haven't told you explicitly. And if you're a visual person, I did a Venn diagram that just shows where people can fall. So an instructor may or may not have a PhD. So you can see I fall right here, that pink dot is me. So doctor and instructor apply to me equally. And there are other people who would have a doctorate but are not professors. Professors are pretty much going to entirely be doctors, and some people can be doctors without being either. And then if we wanted to check how do we know that, I use my supervisor, Dr. Sturdy, as my example. So I see here he has a PhD, hence Dr. Sturdy, but I can also see that he is a professor of science in the Department of Psychology, so we could call him Professor Sturdy as well. Though my next trick is if you email somebody and you start formal with their proper title, you'd say, hello, Dr. Sturdy, here is my question about things in your class. When he responds, I double check how he signs off. Because I've worked with Chris for years, I know that he's going to sign pretty much everything Chris. And that's him telling me that I would be okay, I'd probably be safe to reply using his sign-off name in my next email. So next time I'd say, hey Chris, here's my follow-up question. So you might notice, I think for me, in my sign-off, I'll have just my first name, which is saying that, hey, we've been introduced, you can now just call me Kimberly, and that's fine too. And it's the reason why I use my full name is because there's actually another Kim Campbell here. And if you are Canadian and a little bit of a history buff, Kim Campbell was the first female Prime Minister of Canada back in the 90s. So we happen to have the same name, and she happens to also work here at the university. So I get her emails, I get her mail, I've been invited to galas and things like that. So I've had to meet up with her and trade stuff back. She's a very lovely lady, she seems very sweet, but it led to a lot of confusion when I started teaching. So I just give you guys the heads up when you're writing to me, make sure it is me, and not her. So just double check that. But yeah, so I go with my first full name just to avoid confusion. All right, so that was quite a tangent, but hopefully some useful information if you haven't heard that before. And then our next section is actually getting into the class stuff. So we'll talk a little bit about EClass because that's basically where you're going to be going for all the important stuff for this course. And then we'll delve into what's left over in our syllabus. Most of that information's already on EClass. And then we'll finally get out of all this day one stuff and we'll move on into sort of actual content. But let me get out of here. Perfect. All right. So this is our EClass page. So just looking at it, I will point out I have a couple of things that I've noticed just sitting here that need changing. You might notice that I'm using the old course code. That's just force of habit. The psych department recently switched from PSYCH to CH. I don't remember why. They didn't really tell us, but they did this in the fall term, and I haven't sunk up to that. I've been teaching with the old codes for so long that I'll eventually get everything transitioned over, but if you see the wrong one, that's just me. I'll probably fix it at some point, but don't panic. This information here, this is just sort of me, my email with a quick link to it. So you don't have to type it in or anything. That helps avoid some of that mail going missing. For RTA, I also have her email address and the link to that as well. Below that, we have our announcements. So if I need something to go out to everyone in the class, I'll send out an announcement. That actually also sends you guys an email. So you don't have to constantly scour the announcements page. If you know that you got an announcement and you don't want to search for it, you can just click here and it lists them all together, but it will send you an email that lets you know what's going on. We also have our syllabus here, which I actually should have a copy of, because this is going to be some useful information. I have the previous TA, we just switched. So this was the last TA that I was supposed to have, but we actually have Sarah, so I'll actually have to update that. But we have all of our information here, prerequisites and all of that, expectations, our textbook. This is what the textbook looks like. Pardon me. I put this as a recommended textbook. It's a very, very good textbook. I actually really like this one. However, I am usually of the opinion that if you're not someone who reads a textbook, then there's no point in actually buying it. So I don't love asking questions that are only going to come from the textbook and you'll only get if you've read the textbook cover to cover. It seems like if something's important enough to ask a question about, it should have been important enough to talk about in class. So if you are a textbook reader, it's a very good one and it will help illustrate with extra examples and visuals and stuff like that. I don't teach exactly word for word from the textbook, so there's two different sources of information. So if you do use textbooks, it will help, but don't feel like you need it. There's all the information and links for that. We also have our schedule here. So this is an approximation of what we're going to cover and when we're going to cover it. This is always sort of plus or minus a couple of days. I take a little while to figure out how quickly I need to teach. And so sometimes we'll end up getting really ahead or really behind until I get into the swing of it. But this is our general goal. So this includes things like when our midterms are, reading week, our assignments, and stuff like that. Then from that, we do have midterms, 2 midterms and a final exam. We have chapter quizzes. So for each of the chapters that we cover in class, I will be posting a small quiz. Those are meant to be basically an encouragement for you to continue studying the topics and sort of going over stuff as we move through it. The way that I do my chapter quizzes is that I make them due on the same day that you're being tested on those chapters. So if our midterm 1 covers chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, then those 4 chapter quizzes are due the same day as that midterm. That way, if you want to do them as we cover them, great. But you don't then have to remember that every Tuesday or every Thursday there's a chapter quiz due. More dates is more confusion, so I avoid that. So everything's due on the midterm days. And then for the last set of them, the due date is set presently as the last lecture day, just because we don't know when the final exam is, so I needed to put a date in. So we're just doing the last day of class. That may get pushed back if we need to, but that's fine. For our written assignments, we're going to be doing those much later in the semester, so they're going to be in March and April. We'll talk about those when they get a little bit closer. Usually with my assignments, I like us to get basically through the first midterm, get our feet under us, and then we'll talk about the assignments. But if you wanted to look at the information for that, it's all up on our EClass now, so you can look at it early if you would like. With the chapter quizzes, I don't think I mentioned it. They're going to be multiple choice for the most part, and they're open book with no time limit. The goal there is if you wanted to, you could look at them, then read the chapter textbook, or watch the lectures or whatever, and then go back and answer them. And so you can open them and close them and everything as many times as you want until you're ready to submit or until that due date. They will auto-submit on the due date, so if you forget to hit the submit button, don't worry, it saves you where you are, and it'll just submit as it is. I've learned that it's a good idea to have some of those backup systems in place, so if something goes wrong, it's going to do the best it can. So it'll save where you are and submit for you if it needs to. All right, for the midterms and the final exam, so you've probably figured out this room is a little bit cluttered. There are 120 students in this class, which is exactly the number of chairs, I believe, that are in this room. So we don't have everybody attending today, but it gets really, really packed. And because of that, and the fact that I mostly teach intro courses, what I started to do is I do an option of how you want to take your exams. Some people have been doing online exams and they've gotten really used to being able to write their exams at home in their study space. And some people have really missed having paper exams. So what I do is I give you the option to pick. Same exam, do you want it on paper or do you want it online? And what I'll do is when we get close to those exams, I'm going to send out an announcement that says, hey, if you want a paper copy, send me an email and I'll print as many paper copies as I need. Otherwise, I will assume that you're taking it online. Both versions are open book, so you can use whatever resources you want. Like I said, I'm not all about memorizing. I'd much rather you understand concepts and be able to apply them. So things like names and dates are not those critical points in my questions. It's more, do you understand the concepts and can you make connections? So open book, with the option of do you want to do it online or in person, and the details for all of that will come out as we get closer to the exams, but that's sort of the important stuff to keep in mind. The midterms are not cumulative, so what that means is that the first midterm covers the first 4 chapters, the next midterm covers the next 4, so the only time we'll see stuff from the earlier chapters tested is if it's been carried forward and talked about in the more recent chapters. Then when we get to the final exam, that's when we test on a little bit of everything, but the final exam focuses mainly on the new concepts that we haven't tested yet. I usually do about a 70-30 split, where about 30% of the questions come from the earlier topics, so you don't have to know tons of info, and then everything else is from the later topics. So that works out to be a pretty good setup for that. I'll also have some practice quizzes so that if you want to see what kinds of questions you might encounter, there will be those available on EClass for you to go through. For missed stuff, basically if you're going to have to miss something, if you have to miss a deadline, I always tell students, if you can tell me in advance, if you know beforehand, let me know with as much warning as you can. I have a lot more flexibility if you give me a heads up in advance. If you miss and have to tell me after the fact, there's a 24-hour window. If you're incapacitated and can't get to me in that time, that's obviously understandable. We'll make something work. But within 24 hours, you basically just need to let me know what's going on and why you had to miss. And then we'll discuss how we're going to approach with that. With the midterms, I'm not able to make multiple follow-up midterms. It's too much work for the number of students who end up missing. So if you miss a midterm, we just switch the weight to the final exam if you successfully get the deferral approval. And then that way your final is just worth more and it's on the same concepts overall. If you have to defer a final exam, that's where it gets a little bit weird. Basically, instructors have control over everything except the final. So if you have to miss a final, then you have to apply to your faculty to get approval for a deferral, which you're probably not going to remember by the end of the semester, but I always give you a heads up. If you contact me and say that you need to miss the final, I will then direct you to contact your faculty. But all the information for that is here. All right, I already mentioned the email policy, so tell me as much as you can about what you do understand so I can answer. Please also give me this course code in your email subject line, just because I teach multiple classes and the answers to those questions will change dramatically depending on which class you're in. So that will be useful. And then I think everything else is just the standard stuff that's in a syllabus. So if you want to, you can read through this. There's lots of resources and links and things like that. But I'm not going to read through it all. Okay, so that got us through that big chunk there. Next, we have this really nice collapsed setup here with all of our different sort of links and bits and bobs. So I put the email policy once again, along with links, which I'll have to swap that one out. Textbook information, so this is the information for that text that I showed you. You can get it at the bookstore or you can get it online. We also have frequently asked questions. I'll adapt that as time goes on. If I start seeing the same questions over and over again, I will add to it, but for the most part, I typically get a lot of people asking, can I use an older version of the textbook? And the answer is yes, with an asterisk. Yes, but be aware that it might not have the exact same content. I don't have an older version of the textbook to compare against, so I don't know if everything's the same or not, but if it's get an older version or not bother with the textbook, you can probably do just fine with the older versions. All right, and then the rest of this stuff is going to be some of our sort of references and our lectures and our slides. So that's where you're going to access that stuff. We'll also have lecture recordings. That's where I'll dump my links to the recordings after class. I usually try and do it while I'm at the front of the room before I pack up. That way it gives YouTube some time to process. But every once in a while I won't have time to do it. Maybe there's lots of questions or whatever. So it might have to wait until I get home. So you might see that it takes about an hour to go up, maybe a little bit longer. If it's not up by sort of the evening of the day of lecture, you can send me a reminder and say, hey, did something happen? But usually it's, I had to drive home and or I forgot. Our chapter quizzes are in here as well. They all have their different due dates. So like I said, you have as much time as you want with each of those, as long as you don't submit them. And I've posted all 12 at once, so you can work ahead if you would like, or you can just do them sort of one at a time. It's entirely up to you. This is going to be where the assignment information is. Actually, I didn't post the paper yet. I'll post the description after class if you wanted to sort of cheat and look ahead. But most of what I'm going to be getting you to do is just to read over some scientific papers and provide a summary showing that you can read and take out the useful information from a scientific paper. And then the practice exams at the bottom. So you get to see sort of what kinds of questions you will see. These are not worth anything. They're just there as a resource. You can take them as many times as you want. So you don't have to do it if you don't want to. And these are set up with a time limit so that you can actually see what happens if you are, say, doing an exam and your time runs out. It'll do the same thing that our normal exams would do, which is it'll auto-save and submit when the time runs out or when the deadline hits. Everything's set up the same way with all of those background fail-safes. Okay, so I think that is everything I wanted to cover. Can anybody think of anything else course specific? Yes?
The dates that you have in the syllabus and on EClass for the quizzes are different. And also, like, on the syllabus, you said, like, you would have the quizzes due on the same day as, like, the midterm.
Mm-hmm.
But, like, you wrote 16 and 6. So, like, the midterm was the 16th and the quizzes were due the 6th.
That might just be a me thing. I will double check. It'll be, actually, let's see if I can do this. You see where I went wrong. Okay, so it should be the 16th and the 2nd. So I'll make sure that those change to match that. And then the last one will be our last day of class, which is the 11th. So that's when those are going to show up as due. But yeah, mostly I copied over from last semester and I thought I changed it all, but I'll make sure I fix that. Cool. Yes?
Are the quizzes completion graded or like however much you got on it?
However much you got on it, yeah. So there's going to be, I think it's, I can't remember if it's 10 or 15 questions. 10, except the first one, because I find the first chapter, it's very straightforward and it was hard to make 10 questions, so I did 5. But yeah, so it'll be if you get 9 out of 10 right, you get 90% on that. And then at the end of the semester, I add them all up and use that to generate your overall for the quizzes.
And how do you know where the separation between like chapter 1 and a lecture versus chapter 1 book is
Oh, the lectures line up with the books. Yeah, so if I've labeled it as chapter 1, like so here we have chapter 1 slides, that's going to be all of the stuff from the book in chapter 1.
And that'll be the only stuff that's testable? Nothing exclusive on the chapter quizzes?
Nope. Yes?
I guess I just want to confirm, because when you're going through the syllabus and then you're going through the classes, I recommend versus required. So is it supplementary or is it required?
It's supplementary, yeah. So like I am using this textbook to decide what I teach about, but if I've ignored something in the textbook, it's probably because it's not important enough to talk about. So I will ask you what I think is most important, and I'll teach you about what I think is most important.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Still get it.
Yeah, it's a good textbook, so yeah.
Sorry, I may not follow up. So, what should I do if I want to take the online midterm exam and finals?
Then you'll just click into, there'll be another one of these tabs. I'll make a new one that just says online examinations. And on the day of the exam, you'll click into that, just like you do for the chapter quizzes.
Okay. So the exam is open book. So if I take notes on the electronic devices, can I bring it to the?
Yep, yeah. My assumption is that you guys are going to have access to either your textbook or your notes or whatever you want. I always give people the heads up because I'm like, they always ask, can I Google stuff? It's like, yes, but keep in mind that the answer that the internet gives you may not match what we learned in the class. So be careful when you do stuff like that. But I ask my questions in such a way that I take into account that you have those at your fingertips. That's why I focus on questions that are less you memorizing information and more showing that you understand and can connect those concepts. But yeah, you'll have access to whatever you want to bring to the exam. Yep. Yes?
Are you going to open up all the quizzes like at once or as we complete the...
They're all available right now. Or they should be. I'm going to double check that my dates are correct because it might still be set to last year. So I will double check that. But after today, they should all be available first thing. Yeah. Yes?
Is the option to write the exams in person or online applicable to the midterms and the
Both midterms and final. I don't put it in the syllabus because it's technically not encouraged by the department. So I do this just because I find that students appreciate it, and trying to get 120 people in a room like this is awful. So I started doing that, and I just try not to say it too loudly so nobody notices. But yeah, I haven't had any students complain yet, so everything's been good so far. But I've been doing this for about a year, which is good so far. But yeah. Are we good there on questions? Oh, yeah. Yes, the quizzes will mark automatically, and once you're finished, it'll let you go back in and sort of review what you did and how you scored and everything like that. And if they don't do that, just send me an email, because there's a whole bunch of behind the scenes little things I need to tick off, and I always seem to miss at least one quiz for whatever reason. All right. Ooh, yes.
When you say auto grade, you get the grade that you got back. Oh, okay, so not after it closes.
No, so you'll get it right away. Yeah. Yeah, and that way, because you can use it then as a study tool, and you can see how you're doing getting up to that midterm. I've done a lot of reading on sort of what's the best way for people to learn, and forcing you to sort of re-access that information and see your progress as you go is usually a lot better than just lump testing you on something where you have to wait like a month to figure out if you understand or not. So I like doing little things like that just so that everybody's learning as we go. Yes? No, you don't have to come into the classroom. Half of the point of that is I typically have students who end up, say, coming in because they're really sick, but they don't want to miss the exam. And I really don't want that in a crammed room with a lot of people. So options are available. So you'll actually find that you get not just the time frame, you'll get the same amount of time, but you can write it any time during the day. So I'll do like a 9 to 5. Yeah. Cool. All right. Then, if we're good with all of that stuff, I'm going to swap over to my slides here. There we go. All right. So, this was another one of those things I noticed I hadn't updated. Your date will be outdated, I think, by like 2 years at this point, because I keep forgetting to change it as time goes on. I always ignore the title slides, but it is for this class. I changed it here. But yeah, so we're going to talk about our chapter 1, and this is going to be a lot of review and a lot of here's why we do what we do in the field, sort of a refresher from 282 and earlier stuff that you would have taken in psych. Like I said at the beginning, I don't know how long we're going to be. Actually, I have to double check. Okay, good. I always have trouble remembering when the classes end, but we'll probably end a couple minutes early. I don't think we're going to finish the chapter because I don't want to throw too much at you, but we'll get started. So this chapter will talk a little bit about some of our history. So how did we get to the point that we are at now? What did people think in the past, and how did those incorrect ways of thinking get us forward to where we are today? I've learned that a lot of the stuff and a lot of the theories that came earlier were really important, not because they were correct right out of the gate, but because they got people thinking in different ways and eventually led us to finding evidence that shaped our theories to get us to current theories. We'll talk a little bit about what learning is and all of the different methods that we can use when we're studying learning. And there are lots and lots and lots of different methods, as we'll see throughout this course. And then we'll talk a little bit about why we use non-human animals. So a lot of the research we're going to talk about are done on model organisms, like the zebra finches I mentioned earlier, or on rats or mice. And we'll talk about why that's the case and why we still consider learning in other species, even when our interest is mainly in understanding how humans learn. How do we make that connection? So we'll see how much of that we get into today, and this will also be giving us sort of a setup for the rest of the course as well, which is really nice. But starting off, one of our earliest figures here is René Descartes, and you've probably heard oodles and oodles about Descartes because he comes up in 104 and 105 and probably 282 and a whole bunch of other psych classes, because this is where we start seeing sort of a pivot point in how we think about human cognition. And so before Descartes, people had figured that human behavior was determined entirely by free will. Everything we do is voluntary, we choose to act, we choose to behave the way that we do, and that was pretty widely accepted for a very, very long time. However, Descartes really didn't love that explanation because people do a lot of stuff that happens without higher thinking. You do things like brushing your teeth and you don't even realize you're doing it when you're finished. You can zone out and still complete the task without consciously thinking of every step involved. You can walk down the street without thinking about where you're putting your feet. In fact, you might notice that if you're going up or down stairs, thinking about the task actually makes it harder. We do a lot better ignoring what we're doing and letting our bodies take over automatically. So Descartes said, no, what we're doing is actually an automatic response to stimuli, at least some of the time. So we can have these involuntary actions that are happening without our conscious awareness. We're doing stuff without being aware or intending for it to happen. And so he didn't actually abandon free will. He just introduced this extra component saying that not everything is free will. We now have both. So things can be both voluntary or involuntary depending on the situation. And this is why when we talk about Descartes, we're talking about dualism. We're looking at this sort of separation of things that happen automatically without conscious intervention and things that happen consciously with that voluntary action, and both are going to be slightly different in how they occur. So we'll actually see on our next slide that we have both of those. But first, I just wanted to mention that this was specific to humans. That voluntary component was specific to humans, and everybody at this time still thought of humans as completely separate from all the other animals. So animals would lack that free will and therefore wouldn't have any kind of voluntary behavior. And because of that, we would say that they don't have any kind of mind or soul to actually drive that voluntary process. So they would just be exclusively automatic responses, and humans were special with that secondary type of action. All right, so that brings us to his model here, where he wanted to look at this dualism concept, where we have that voluntary component driven by our minds and the involuntary component that is reflexive. So these reflexes are so named because what would happen is we'd start off with our physical world, so some kind of external stimulus. It's going to come into our sense organs. There's going to be some nerves that carry that information to our brain, and then they're going to reflect back outward to the muscles via those same nerves. That's another thing that we'll find that he was wrong about. And those nerves will send signals to the muscles that create that involuntary response. So that bouncing back from hitting the brain and reflecting back is why they were called reflexive. And so we can say these reflexes happen with no involvement of our higher mind. So it's just our brain, our nerves, and the stuff that's picking up on and acting on those impulses. And so I kind of hinted that these nerves in this particular model from Descartes said that the nerves would have information moving in both directions. And he thought that this was the case because we'd have special nerves that were responding to particular stimuli and creating particular responses to those stimuli, and having them travel on the same pathways would allow them to move more quickly. So because it's just bouncing and going straight back, we'd have a very fast response. So things like you touch a hot stove, you're going to pull away really, really fast. And so that would be something reflexive or involuntary, and it would be along the same particular nerve to give us that particular response. Nowadays, we know that that's not the case. We have sensory and motor neurons that are going to take information in and out, and they're separate pathways. So what we have is our sensory nerves are going to be carrying that incoming sensory information, and for things like reflexes, like withdrawing from a hot stove, instead of them actually hitting the brain, we have that decision made at the level of our spinal cord, where our interneurons are going to split the signal, send some of that information up to our brains so we can evaluate it, But we can also make a decision that that incoming sensation was too intense and we should have a reflex to withdraw. So we'll send an outgoing signal along motor neurons to our muscles to then contract and pull away. So some of this is actually fairly similar to what we believe nowadays or what we understand nowadays when it comes to reflexes, but there are some shortcomings here. So the single set of nerves is not a great idea. It going all the way to the brain before that decision is made, also not necessarily right, but pretty darn close, which isn't too bad for how long ago this was talked about. If we wanted to look at our voluntary responses, this is where we get a little bit different. And so you might remember that Descartes was really focused on our pineal gland. And so if we look at our brain, our pineal gland is actually fairly special because it's one of the few structures in our brain that isn't existing as a mirrored pair. So we have a single pineal gland right in the middle, and so it's going to be sitting there as a single unit, whereas pretty much everything else we have doubles of. So people saw this and said, this must be really important. And it's right in the middle of our brain, so it's central, so it must be doubly important. And so Descartes and others decided that this pineal gland was basically the pinpoint where we'd have the connection between our non-physical minds, or our souls, and our physical bodies. So we'd have that sort of separation between the two, and things would act through the pineal gland to create physical voluntary responses. And specifically, Descartes said that this happened through the process of animal spirits. So he had some pretty interesting ideas, and this one actually came from the fact that he worked somewhere or lived somewhere near a place with a lot of pneumatic tubes. So they were using pressurized air in order to move things from place to place. So if you have an enclosed space, you apply pressure at one end, the other end is going to move in the opposite direction because we have a set volume. That was pretty common at the time. So he looked at that and said that must be how our muscles work, where if we apply pressure at one place, those spirits that fill the tubes that are our nerves will apply pressure somewhere else, creating movement in our muscles. So that's what he thought was going on if we do something like reach for something. So our muscles are filling with these spirits and sort of moving in that way. And this process involved that sort of intangible mind acting through the pineal gland via the brain, because the pineal gland is in the brain, and it can send out those commands along nerves to act on those muscles. So similar, but involving more steps than what we had for our physical processes in the involuntary functions. And you might notice here that these voluntary processes don't require an external stimulus to trigger them. So we can think about doing something, and that can be sufficient to cause that action to happen. We don't need something in our environment to trigger that thought. Whereas for the involuntary stuff, that does require that external physical stimulus in our environment to cause that cascading action. Okay. So we see that, so we can have these automatic reflexive responses to these external environmental stimuli. And this would be the only process that's available to non-human animals. But humans can also have some of these reflexes as well. That's one aspect of our behavior. And so like we mentioned, we have only one set of those nerves. Those nerves would be hollow tubes, like I had mentioned, and they're going to have animal spirits that fill them that are going to cause effects downstream. So we know that our reflexes are something that, well, Descartes would say that our reflexes are something that are innate and fixed. And we know that, okay, the one set of nerves thing, that's incorrect. The hollow tubes with animal spirits, that is also incorrect. And the innate and fixed component of reflexes, that's also incorrect. So here we're saying, all right, well, there's a lot of stuff there that's wrong. The basic idea where we can have an automatic response to an environmental stimuli, we're okay with that. But everything else, all those other components of how it happens and what they specifically are, we don't hold on to it. So this is our first thought of, okay, well, it got us started, it got us thinking in kind of the right direction, but once we started following up, once we started studying this more in depth, we started realizing this isn't necessarily the full picture. So we know that with things, things can actually be learned. So we can learn to have an automatic behavior. So something simple like Pavlovian conditioning. So if you hear a particular sound paired with a particular stimulus over and over and over again, hearing that sound can produce the response you'd have to that stimulus because of that association. So we can learn to have that automatic response, something we're not intending to produce, right away. Food is a fantastic example of this. Smelling particular foods can make you feel hungry immediately. And there's a lot of places that are really, really good at this. So if you walk into a mall and you smell the Cinnabon smell, you immediately have that feeling, maybe your mouth starts watering. It's an automatic reflexive response because you've learned that that smell comes from those particular foods, and those are really good food. So these aren't necessarily innate, they're not necessarily fixed. We can learn them and we can modify them over time through experience. So we're sort of doubly saying no to the last point. And then this here is actually a visual representation of what I had verbally explained earlier, because I never look ahead in my slides. But this is where we have sort of our incoming sensory information via the sensory neurons and the outgoing motor information through the motor neurons, two separate pathways, which is where we're disagreeing with that first point. And we should, at this point, remember that our neurons are firing specifically by using our action potentials, that changing of charges across our cell membranes. So a slight change in electrical signals through there, involving some chemical signals as well, rather than our hollow tubes with animal spirits. So we have quite a few disagreements here. Okay. So, despite all of these things that we say no to, Descartes was still a really, really useful individual for a lot of these theories. So he was able to describe how reflexes are related to behaviors. He ended up describing these neural circuits that included the brain specifically for two different types of actions, intentional and unintentional. He made that distinction between voluntary and involuntary behavior, which we still think about today. We do still talk about automatic and reflexive behaviors, things that we intend to happen and things that happen without our conscious control. We also have here a description of how our physical world could influence our brain and behavior, something that people weren't really thinking a lot about at that point. And so this ended up leading us into two different schools of thought, mentalism and reflexology. So our mentalism was focusing on the contents and workings of our minds. So how do we think about things? How do we sort of contemplate what's going on? How do we make decisions? Things like that. And then reflexology was focusing on the mechanisms of reflexive behaviors. And these two very different traditions actually ended up carrying forward into a lot of how we think about stuff today, where we can have cognitive psychologists, people who really care about those mental processes and how we think about things, how we categorize things, how we learn things internally. But we can also have maybe more behavioral psychologists who focus on those reflexes, those innate responses, things that happen without a whole lot of conscious thought. So we can have sort of echoes of this carrying through even into modern days, which is pretty cool. For more of these concepts that were influenced here, we can get into the idea of nativism. So this is something that Descartes would have believed in, though he had his own sort of additions and extras to it. But nativism is this idea that we are born with innate ideas. So we are born with particular things already internalized. And so for Descartes, some of the stuff that he thought that we were born with was a concept of God, a concept of self, and a certain fundamental axioms of geometry. Basically knowing that something like the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line rather than a curved line. Stuff like that that sort of seems intuitive. He argued that it was intuitive because we have these inborn concepts. And there were a whole bunch of other things that people would argue as to whether or not they were inborn concepts. But nativism, we really care about this idea that, yeah, we are born and we have stuff that's already there. Nowadays, we might say that nativism is the idea that we have certain genetic stuff hard-coded into our DNA, where we know how to do things without having to learn about them. But at the time, they didn't necessarily have that extra connection to make. A lot of people liked this idea of nativism, but as we typically see in psychology, when you have people who have one particular stance on one side of the argument, we typically then see another group of people that'll stand on the opposite side of that same argument. So with our nativists on one side, we'd have the rise of our empiricists on the opposite side. So empiricism is a strong reaction in the opposite direction to nativism. And so empiricism is this philosophy that all of our ideas in our minds come from experience. So everything is attained through learning. And the idea would be that we're not born with certain things already present. We have to learn absolutely everything. And so if we go into some of our important empiricists, most of these were also people in Britain, so they are called the British empiricists. The first of these is John Locke, who you probably remember from earlier psych classes. Again, one of those really common individuals to talk about. And he was famous for his idea of a tabula rasa, basically saying that we are born as blank slates or clean slates, where we have nothing internal and everything that we learn throughout our lives has to be learned through experience with our environment. So we start with nothing and have to experience everything to figure everything out. So all of our ideas are acquired through interactions with our environment and understanding and experiencing the outcomes or the consequences of those actions. Another of our empiricists is Thomas Hobbes. And Hobbes said that our voluntary behavior is predictable and lawful. Basically that we're going to act in particular ways, and we're going to act in predictable ways because of previous experiences and stuff that we've learned. And specifically, he really leaned into this idea of hedonism, where we are pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain. And this might kind of sound familiar to, say, things like Thorndike's law of effect, where if an action leads to a good outcome, we do it more often. And if an action leads to a bad outcome, we do it less often. So we're going to do the stuff that gets us things that are pleasurable more often, and we're going to do stuff that leads to pain or bad outcomes less often. We shape our behavior to get more good and avoid more bad, and because of that, our behavior should therefore be very predictable. Which, considering this is a whole course on learning and what sort of drives our behavior in particular ways, this predictability is very important. That's most of what we're trying to learn about in this class, is how we can predict behavior. So this is a pretty important starting point. Another bunch of important concepts for our empiricists, the first being the concept of association. So associations are just links between different concepts or stimuli or ideas. And so we would form simple associations between things if we encounter them together and things like that. So simple associations can end up combining. As we learn more and have more things that we can associate, we can add complexity. And this is how they ended up justifying how we can have such complex behaviors in the long run, because we're able to combine much, much simpler associations, things we've learned previously, to learn more complex and more complex things as time goes on. So this is how we can do things like associating the word for a particular object with that object itself. So our textbook uses the example of a car. So the word car, it doesn't necessarily sound like what a car would sound like. The shape of the letters doesn't look like a car would look like, but because we've used that word in conjunction with that type of object and that whole category of objects, we're able to associate them, and the word itself can be sufficient to evoke a mental image of that concept. So we've learned to associate things that didn't necessarily link directly. And if we think about it, that's a lot of what we do. So language is all about those associations. We've learned through experience. And once you've learned enough of the base words, you can then learn about other words by associating them with different words that you've already learned. So we can start stacking and adding that complexity as time goes on. So a pretty good example of associations. And the way that they tried to explain a lot of these associations are through our primary laws of association. And these are sort of borrowed and modified from Aristotle. So they weren't just invented by our British empiricists, but it was more co-opted because they saw that people had thought about this idea before. So let's see what we can do with that. So we have three main concepts we care about. The first being contiguity. Basically, when things occur close together in either time and or space, usually both would be preferred. But if we can have things occurring close together, it's a lot easier to associate them. This makes logical sense, and this is actually our law of association that is most widely studied. So if things are presented sort of immediately one after the other or simultaneously in the same location, it's pretty easy for us to link together. So if a child sees a car drive by and you say the word car over and over again, those two things being contiguous, close together, makes it a lot easier to associate them. Whereas if the car drives by and you wait 10 minutes and then say the word, they're much more distant from one another, a lot harder to associate. We can also have similarity, which is less common but still has some evidence for it, where if things share features, we tend to conceptually link them. This is something like forming categories, where when we're talking about cars, we basically want something that has 4 wheels and is sort of vaguely box-shaped. So there's lots of different types of cars, lots of different shapes and colors, makes and models, but they're all cars because they have certain qualities that make them similar to one another. I always find it interesting because I study categorization, but cars are one of those things where you have, okay, well, is it an SUV or is it a crossover or is it a sedan? Where do we draw the line between all those different subcategories of vehicles? That could be an interesting thing to study because everybody might divide it a little bit differently. But that's all based on similarity. The last of these laws is the law of contrast. And this one doesn't actually have a lot of, doesn't really have any evidence, but they thought that if things were very, very different from each other, that it might be easier to conceptually link them. So if you have someone who's really, really tall and really, really short, you might sort of associate them together. There's not really any studies that have shown that this works. So that one we kind of dismiss. But the first two we do have studies that support, and especially our contiguity, that's a massive component of most of modern studies of learning. All right, so then as time goes on, we got into some of our secondary laws of association, and these are sort of extra stuff that we start considering. So we can look at things like intensity and frequency and recency, but also our existing associations. So these are other factors that can kind of modulate how quickly we learn something, how quickly we can learn to associate things. So intense stimuli are usually a lot easier to learn about. This is stuff that you probably remember back from Psych 104, where we would have talked about intense stimuli and intense responses are a lot more memorable, so we tend to learn about them a lot faster. So you might learn to have a fear response to a really, really loud sound, but a quieter version might not be as scary, and it might take you longer to start jumping because of it. Frequency, as stuff happens more often together. If we have more and more pairings, that association tends to get stronger. Recency, so if something has happened fairly recently, we are probably going to do a better job remembering it. As stuff has sort of happened further and further back in time, it's a lot harder to remember. And then our existing associations, like we've said, if you've already learned to associate certain things, that can modify other associations. So if you've already learned that most things with 4 wheels and kind of boxy shapes are cars, and you see something that's kind of car shaped, maybe it has 3 wheels, but it has everything else, maybe you'd be more likely to call that a car if it matches all of the other things that go into that category. So all of these can definitely have a role. So one of the problems with all of these is that as logical as they seem and as basic and understandable it comes across as on the surface, a lot of the philosophers in our British empiricist group, they talked about this and they worked through the logic and they all agreed that these things definitely happen, but they never actually went through and tested it, which is actually really frustrating because when they talk about empiricism, because they are empiricists, they didn't actually do any empirical studies. So we typically use the word empirical when we're talking about scientific study, when we're trying to sort of measure and quantify and test different theories, but they didn't actually do any of that. They stuck to their sort of sitting and thinking about thinking, but they didn't test any of their theories. So a lot of the support that we have came much, much later, but the ideas were put into place by these empiricists. They just had to be tested much later on in time. So how did we actually end up testing these things? This is when we get into Ebbinghaus. And so you might remember Ebbinghaus because he was all about nonsense syllables and memorizing lists. So what he did was he created tons and tons of these nonsense syllables, mostly because he really wanted to avoid the possibility of prior associations. So if he used words that existed, then our previous associations with those words, the concepts that we've already formed, would end up influencing how memorable something is or isn't. So he found a bunch of combinations, two consonants separated by a vowel, and if it wasn't a word, then he would use it. So he had tons of these weird little combinations, and he put them into lists. And for this case, while testing is a good thing and we wanted this sort of evaluation and this critical thinking, the problem here is that Ebbinghaus actually tested this only on himself, at least at first. So he was his own subject. So we didn't really have anything like proper experimental vetting, but he got us started. So what he would do is he'd memorize the list and then he would test his ability to recall that list under different conditions. So he'd look at things like how long was he able to rehearse that list? How did he rehearse that list? Did he think about connections? Did he just read it over? Did he say it out loud or in his head? All sorts of different variations. And he also checked on the closeness within the list. So if he remembered the first nonsense word-ish, was he also then able to remember the next one and the one after that? Or was it sort of the position had no effect? And he found a bunch of different things, mostly that different conditions, like how much studying he did, had a dramatic effect on how much he remembered. And the position within the list also had a massive effect. So you might remember things like our primacy effect and recency effect. We'd see a little bit of that here, where the early stuff might have sunk in more, and the more recent stuff might have stuck around if he didn't delay his recall. We also found that if stuff was close together in the list, he also started forming associations between them. So if this always follows this, then he might remember those two as a pair because of that proximity. So different things would affect how he remembered and what he remembered and how much he remembered. So this is where we start seeing things like our forgetting curves and our learning curves, and he looked at our spacing effect and all of the stuff that got people started with how well do we remember words in lists. And even to this day, asking people to remember lists of words is still a fairly common practice when studying memory. So we still do stuff like checking, do we have a primacy and a recency effect? Do we have that sort of U-shaped curve that shows that the early stuff we do a good job encoding, and the late stuff we do a good job holding on to in our sort of immediate memory, and then everything kind of in the middle tends to go away. But he'd also look at things like, okay, well, what if I study it really intensively, multiple days at a time, and then I test myself every day for a month? How long before those start going away? And things like that. So he did tons and tons of variations on this, and it got us started with a lot of what we understand about how we learn and forget, specifically when it comes to lists of words. All right. So, if we're moving on to our discussion of reflexes sort of after what we got from Descartes, we mentioned before that, yeah, Descartes got the basic theory of a reflex arc correct. The way that he talked about it as something that sort of happens fairly quickly and it's that incoming signal and then an outgoing signal, that part was okay. So we have a stimulus in our environment that triggers some kind of automatic response, but his mechanism was way off. And we saw what our alternative was, using our interneurons in the spine to make that evaluation, the incoming sensory information and the outgoing motor information. That whole process is a little bit different than what he thought. So if all we had was Descartes' stuff and people wanted to understand, well, what's actually going on? What else might be happening? We started seeing more people start talking about, okay, well, what else could be going on? What else are we not understanding from Descartes' perspective? And so we start getting into individuals like Sechnov and Pavlov, who are starting to look at things that might be involved in this sort of reflexive behavior. Not specifically just reflex arcs, the ones that happen automatically, but, or I guess the ones that happen automatically at the level of our spinal cord specifically, because we're getting into slightly different terminology. That would be a reflex arc. But reflexive behavior, stuff that doesn't involve that conscious role, that's where we start getting some extra studies. So these Russian researchers were starting to look at things like, okay, well, how do we get automatic behavior? How do we get that learned component? And what's going on? What's driving that? And interestingly, both of these, so they're Russians, both named Ivan, but one is Sechnov, one is Pavlov. And of these two, we know a lot more about Pavlov because we typically talk about him extensively in terms of Pavlovian conditioning or classical conditioning. But the other Ivan also was important. So we'll start with Sechnov. Because he started focusing on this idea that our input from the environment was not necessarily equivalent to the output in our responses. Prior to this, when we were looking at that sort of reflexive bouncing that we had from Descartes, we were saying that, okay, so the stimulus in our environment was providing a certain amount of energy that would sort of bounce, and we'd have an equivalent output of energy. So a larger stimulus would produce a larger response. So if you touch the stove and it's a little bit hot, you might withdraw kind of quickly. But if you touch the stove and it's really, really hot, you'd withdraw very, very quickly. So you'd have that sort of matching of energy levels. However, if we think about this, there isn't necessarily that equivalence. And this is where Sechnov came in, saying that, okay, our input, the energy that's coming in, isn't automatically reflected, it isn't automatically sort of represented in that output. Because we might have a reflexive response to, say, do nothing. So we have an energy input and maybe we see freezing behavior. So if you look at rats, one of a rat's responses to a loud stimulus in their environment is actually to freeze. So instead of having a startle response or a big jump, they might just stop moving. And so that stimulus in the environment, that high energy thing, led to an inhibition of response in terms of behavior. So that mismatch opens up some new possibilities. So if our response strength is independent of our stimulus strength, then we can start having some other explanations, some other ideas. So Sechnov said, well, maybe our voluntary thoughts and behaviors are actually being elicited by inconspicuous or faint stimuli, meaning that they're not driven by nothing, like what we thought with Descartes, but they're actually being driven by something in our environment that maybe we can't detect and therefore aren't consciously aware of. So our theoretically voluntary behaviors might themselves be reflexive, might be driven by something external. We just aren't aware of what's causing it. So we can then extend our use of this reflex mechanism to explain stuff more complicated, stuff that we had previously thought was voluntary and completely driven by consciousness. It could be something else. One of the problems with this, though, with this sort of reflexes are everything idea, is that it doesn't actually explain how our experience can alter behavior. So this is just focusing on stuff happens automatically, but it doesn't show how it can be modified by experience. It can't be modified by learning from our environment. So it wasn't a perfect explanation. It wasn't the whole picture. But we are starting to move in that direction of, okay, well, maybe there's other stuff going on. So, what did Pavlov add to this? And Pavlov should be someone we're familiar with at this point. But Pavlov was really important because he conducted a lot of these empirical studies. He tested things under different situations. He manipulated things and looked at the outcomes. He gave us something that we can quantify. And it gave us a really good understanding of what we're going to come to call SR units associations, or stimulus response associations. So we're looking at a particular stimulus like food, or the bell that's rung before food, and the response to that particular stimulus. So getting food and salivating, or eventually hearing a bell that was paired with food and then salivating. So he cared a lot about those stimulus response associations, and he studied that fairly extensively. And that pairing of stimulus and response is actually still very, very important and widely studied, even in modern understandings of learning. So Pavlov focused on this idea that our reflexes, or new reflexes, could be learned through associations. Ringing a bell wouldn't have caused a dog to salivate, except that now that we've associated it with food, that link means that ringing the bell makes the dog think food-like thoughts and then salivates because of that. That might be a little bit too cognitive, too much of the consciousness aspect in terms of an explanation, but that's one way to think about it. And so this he ended up sort of being interested in a field called functional neurology. Basically, how does our nervous system work? And this nervism was focusing on how our behavioral and physiological processes get regulated by our nervous system. So how is a response produced by those internal activations of our nervous system? And he did a lot of this by studying digestion and reflexes related to digestion in dogs. The whole salivation thing was his main focus. We'll talk tons more about Pavlov in chapter 3, because that's when we start getting into our Pavlovian/classical conditioning. However, we are right at the end of class here, so I'm going to stop. We will actually finish we're right at the halfway point. So we'll finish this on Tuesday. So I'll see you guys for that.